Live from the School of Athens. This is Europe and the People Without History with Mr. Olson, everyone's favorite AP World History Review service. Today we are going to begin our discussion of Period 5 in the AP World History Concept Outline. This period is dubbed the Long 19th Century by my favorite historian, Eric Hobsbawm. So it covers the year 1750, which is roughly the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and the College Board says 1900, but I'm going to say 1914, which is the outbreak of World War I in Europe. So to get this party started, let's talk about key concept 5.1, which says the process of industrialization the process of industrialization changed the way in which goods were produced and consumed, with far-reaching effects on the global economy, social relations, and culture. Go ahead and pause me and put it into your own words, and then we can get this party started. All right, so I said the increased use of machines changed the way things were bought and sold. It also changed social relations and culture. Very easy. Okay, so before we go any further, I want to make it known that this period deals with four main topics. One is the Industrial Revolution, two is imperialism, three is revolutions, and four is migration. So those are the rough outline of all these videos. So let's go ahead and talk about industrialization. For the record, this is going to be a long one. It's not going to be short because not only is this my favorite topic in all of world history, but it is also one that is jam-packed full of important stuff. So if you think you're going to get this one done in one sitting, make sure you block out some time. Otherwise, just go ahead and put me on pause and revisit me later. So key concept 5.1, Roman numeral 1, industrialization fundamentally changed how goods were produced. So hopefully you went over this in your classes this year at some point. And it should make it really easy, so we'll try to get through it as quick as we can. So, causes of the Industrial Revolution. Well, it's important to note that it starts in England. Why does it begin there? Well, first, England has geographical benefits. One is a vast amount of coal. It also has a number of rivers and water that make it easy to build canals that can help power factories. In addition, there are some political decisions that are made that allow it to begin in England. One is the Insidious Enclosure Acts, which took land away from what we would call the commons, land available to everybody, and fenced it off and made it private property instead, which of course enriched few at the expense of the many. Shocker. Anyways, England's proximity to the Atlantic Ocean made it easily accessible from colonies, but then also allowed it to easily access colonies. And then it has this liberal political tradition that rests in the fact that it had its revolution against its king earlier on than other European countries did, and so it kind of created a place where it was safe to be an entrepreneur, whereas that did not happen in France, say, for example. There were also agricultural innovations that are talked about further in episode 5.4, but we'll just mention them here. There were technological innovations in the realm of agriculture and changes in agricultural methods. Technological innovations included things like Jethro Tull's seed drill, which allowed you to plant seeds more efficiently and more quickly, and then crop rotation allowed for you to get more out of the crops that you planted because more nutrients stayed in the ground. So because of those two things, you have an increase in the amount of people that can work in factories. Okay, we'll get there in a second. All right, so causes of the Industrial Revolution continued. We know that it begins in England, and we know why now, so let's see what happens there. Well, there are several technological innovations that help spur this movement. The most important one, I emphasize, the most important one that should show up in any essay that is on the Industrial Revolution is the steam engine. It wasn't invented by, but it was sort of made better by James Watt. And the steam engine is really interesting because it uses coal to work, and many of them were initially used to get coal out of the ground. So the Industrial Revolution has this funny cycle where it sort of needs itself to happen. Okay, another technological innovation was the water frame that was created by Richard Arkwright. This basically allowed for thread to be spun onto spools, which made the whole process of making textiles easier. Now, these two things allowed for businesses and the textile industry in particular to be reorganized, and it was organized into what we call the factory system. This factory system replaced the cottage industry, which was the old way of making textiles, which is where each piece was done in a different person's cottage, hence the name cottage industry. Sort of moved around, was very expensive. It was more of an artisanal task. Now specialization of the tasks under one roof, mostly done by machines. No more manpower, All machine power, baby. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution has got its foothold and it starts to spread throughout time and place. It spreads through place. It begins in England, then it moves to America, then it moves to other parts of Europe, including Russia, and then it moves to Japan. For the record, Japan is not in Europe, but it does go to Japan eventually, and with the help of Europeans and Westerners. Uh, this coincides with the political transformation known as the Meiji Restoration, which will come up here and there throughout Key Concept 5.1 and the other key concepts in period 5. Okay, Key Concept 5.1, Roman numeral 1, continues with the fact that the Industrial Revolution spreads through time as well. The first Industrial Revolution is that one which begins in about 1750 in England and is focused mainly on textiles. However, since capitalism is a thing that can never stop creating technological innovation, we get a second industrial wave in the late 19th century and early 20th century that, while it's centered in the United States, has heavy impact on places in Europe. Predominantly, this is where Russia comes into play. It's focused on heavy industry, steel, chemicals, electricity, more powerful railroads, and things like that. When you think industrialization, this is what you're thinking of. The first industrial revolution, while it had coal being burnt and steam engines, this second one that relies more heavily on fossil fuels like oil are what you think about. So I just want you to bear in mind that there are two phases of this big deal. The first is more important, but the second is more recognizable. Okay, Key Concept 5.1, Roman numeral 2. New patterns of global trade and production developed and further integrated the global economy as industrialists sought raw materials and new markets for the increasing amount and array of goods produced in their factories. So industrialization forces Europeans to look elsewhere for their raw materials because Europe is a place that doesn't have many. So take, for example, cars, which are a staple of that second industrial revolution. Cars need tires, tires need rubber. You get rubber from trees. If you didn't know that, it's amazing. Check this out. It never ceases to amaze me. At least you cut sort of diagonal spirals in these trees and the rubber just flows like sap, which is kind of what it is. Anyways, can't get that in Europe, so you got to go elsewhere to get it, and you largely go to either Africa or the Amazon or Southeast Asia. Those are the places where you can find it. Europeans got to get it, so they have to go elsewhere. Now, when they do that, they create what we call monocultures. Now, these are areas that produce lone commodities. Instead of having a diverse rainforest, you knock it all down and plant rubber trees. Just so you know, this is bad for environments and it's bad for traditional societies. However, it's good for the capitalists and the companies that are running this whole operation. And I guess that's all we really care about, right? Go team. This is not the only time that this was done, and I know that the College Board has asked about things like this in the past, how the environments are destroyed by various types of changing of the environments. If I go to the Caribbean and I plant only sugar, it's not good for the environment. If I go to North America and I plant only tobacco, it's not good for the environment. If I go to Southeast Asia and I plant only rubber trees, it's not good for the environment. If I go to India and I plant only opium, it's not good for the environment. Okay, you get the point. We'll move on. Europeans now, they extract all these materials and it leads to impoverishment of those areas, both environmentally and materially for the people who live there. So if I'm Cecil Rhodes and I own the De Beers Mining Company and I go to South Africa and I rip all the diamonds out of the earth, well, what does that leave for the people who live in South Africa? A whole lot of nothing. Other things that were exploited during this time, obviously we already talked about the amazing, amazing rubber trees, but palm oil is something that we often overlook because nobody in America knows what that is. Basically a cooking oil, but was also used in lamps before there was electricity. That was taken largely from West Africa, one of the most important commodities of the time that you probably didn't talk about in class. And then cotton in India. Cotton becomes incredibly important when the United States goes through its civil war because Europe has to find it from elsewhere. Okay, anyways, it's important to note that European taking all this stuff out of these areas is bad for those areas. Now, to continue, the industrialization that we see floods the market with cheap machine made goods. Now, this is going to totally ruin artisans in other places in the world. For example, the Middle East and India had been making textiles for years, and they had the most intricate, amazing designs on their textiles. They were hand woven a lot of the time and were very, very eloquent. England floods the market with their cheap crap and destroys these industries. Um, and because this makes these companies a lot of money, they're able to expand even more than the expansion that we saw in period 4 because these places need new people to buy their stuff. So the global economy expands exponentially. So there's more materials that are being sought after. That contributes to the expansion. There's more need to find potential consumers. Since England is making so much stuff, it's got to find people to buy it. No longer are we responding to what people want, but companies are telling people what they want and what they need. Hence the reason the rise in advertising. Commodity extraction benefits corporations disproportionately, and it creates this complicated web of commodity transfer throughout the world. So this is truly a world economy now if it hadn't been one before. For example, take the opium trade. Opium, which is grown by the British in India, is then taken by the British and sold to China to get silver out that had been brought from Latin America. So the whole world is connected now. There's no arguing about that one. Okay, moving on. Key concept 5.1, Roman numeral 3. To facilitate investments at all levels of industrial production, financiers developed and expanded various financial institutions. I'm going to try not to get bogged down here, I promise. So there were new ideologies that emerged from this industrialization. One being what we call classical liberalism. Now, I don't want you to think about this in terms of liberal like it's used in American political discourse today. Very different. Liberalism is basically an approach to society that is characterized by enlightenment, freedom, and equality. So the Enlightenment put forth all these ideas like people are free and they should be equal and stuff like that. This is the topic of the 5.3 video that you'll probably be watching later. But a lot of people took this to heart and they started to craft their own views on the world. One of them, and perhaps the most important, is that of Adam Smith, who writes a book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776, which argues that individual or private ownership of the means of production is the way to go. Because if individuals own the means of production, they will do what's best for society because they will be doing what's best for them, and society's needs are the same as their needs. And there's a fundamental misunderstanding there if you ask me, but we won't get into it now. He also preached what we call laissez-faire economics. It's an attitude which espouses that the government should not intervene in the economy whatsoever. In response to this, you have a guy that's only half bad, John Stuart Mill, who preaches an idea called utilitarianism, which is basically you should take ideas and use only the parts that are useful. And so he argued that capitalism is a good idea, but it should be regulated to help curb the issues that it causes. So poverty, famine, it should be curbed to it should be regulated to help stop that stuff. Otherwise, it's a good system. He very confused, but certainly not the worst sort of idea. Now, in order to help facilitate the growth of this global economy, we also see new organizational forms, or industrialization changes the way that businesses are formed. So instead of having state-sponsored mercantilism, you're now going to have joint stock companies, which we've talked about earlier in this series. But the best example is the Virginia company that was a British company that oversaw the settlement of North America. We also see what we call transnational or global corporations like the Dutch East India Company that controlled much of Southeast Asia, particularly the trade in spices. And you see limited liability corporations. This is probably not a term that made its way into your classes. However, it's mentioned in the concept outline as a suggested term, so we'll go ahead and explain it here. A limited liability corporation is one in which individuals assume only a small fraction of liability in the business ventures that they participate in. So I'm going to give a little bit of my money to a company. If that company goes under or does something bad, I'm only on the hook for a little bit of it. I have limited liability. Best example of this is the British East India Company, which had pooled resources from a lot of different people's wallets. So those are new ways of organizing your companies. There's also new financial institutions. For example, stock markets, a place where somebody can go and buy shares in a company and they can be a part of these limited liability corporations. And then also, countries started to use what we call the gold standard, which means that fiat or paper money is backed by gold, which made trading more universal and more easy, something that the Chinese had been doing for a long time, and then Europeans are just getting to the party with. Okay, key concept 5.1, Roman numeral 4, states that there were major developments and innovations in transportation and communication, including railroads, steamships, telegraphs, and canals. This one's easy enough. Um, there are transportation innovations during the time that coincide with industrialization. Makes sense. Railroads become more efficient because the materials used in them are stronger, and also the steam engine makes them faster as the steam engine itself improves as time goes on. So you see in a vast English rail network, you see England instituted a rail network in India that improves their ability to move commodities um, throughout the subcontinent. You see the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States and the Trans-Siberian Railroad in Russia, which allow for the effective movement of goods from one side of that massive country to the other. You see the use of canals. Pictured here is the famous and important Suez Canal, which is built by the descendants of Muhammad Ali in Egypt. And this cuts the amount of time it takes to get from England to India almost in half. There's also the Panama Canal, which cuts the time it takes to get from New York to San Francisco more than in half. And these canals create new and more efficient ways to travel from point A to point B, but they also create important business ventures. The Suez Canal, while built by the Egyptians, is financed largely by European powers, but then eventually taken over by Britain and seized. The Panama Canal is built largely by the United States and held on to until the year 2000. You go, America. You go. There's also improved communication, the telegraph, which there's a transatlantic cable late in the 1860s that allows London to talk to New York. This is good for business and good for stock exchanges and things like that. And then later in the period, we see the radio and the telephone, which are both important communication improvements. And then you see more effective modes of travel like steamships. Steamships, people traveled on them like Jack Dawson, and then they've sometimes died like he did on the Titanic. That's a joke, of course. But steamships were important because the places who had them, like the United States, were able to influence the places who didn't, like Japan, when Matthew Perry showed up in 1853 and basically browbeat the Japanese into industrializing and keeping their market open for American use. That's nice, but hey, it gave us the Meiji Restoration, so I guess that's good. Key concept 5.1, Roman numeral 5. The development and spread of global capitalism led to a variety of responses. Again, I'm going to try and not get bogged down here, but I make no promises. Okay, so there were domestic responses to industrial capitalism. Most of these will have to do with England. However, you can be sure that these types of responses happened in most places that were industrialized. So, reform movements against the ills of industrialization were best exemplified by the emergence of things like labor unions, which of course are groups of workers that band together in order to exert power over their employers. Usually they were not successful, but in some examples they were. For instance, the government listened to labor unions and instituted new pieces of legislation like shorter hours, no child labor, safer conditions, higher wages, stuff like that. You also see certain groups that I would consider reformers that took it to the means of production. Pictured here are the Luddites of England, who literally destroyed the means of production because they saw the means of production as destroying their livelihood. The machines took jobs, so the Luddites took out the machines. Eventually, the sort of founder. Not shocking there. Okay, people also advocated for alternative versions of societal organization like utopian socialism, which were people who wanted to remove entirely from society and start their own utopias, which they thought would provide perfect worlds. That didn't work out so well. More applicable were the ideas of people like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who put forth ideas of socialism and communism, which were reorganizations of society along the lines of more equality and more fairness to all. Okay, so global responses to industrialization. This is an important set of ones, so I'm sure that you're going to recognize some stuff here, but hopefully this allows for better understanding. So some states sponsored their own industrialization efforts. You see this in Japan, for example, and under the Meiji government, which ended the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868, institutes a number of economic reforms to make them more like the West. So they support the building of railroads, and they use domestic capital to facilitate industrial production, mostly in the textile industry. So they use both silk and cotton to get into the textile business. But the use of those railroads is really important because it takes what was a feudal society under the Tokugawa and makes it a more modernized one. You might stop and take a picture or take a look at this picture here. This is an image of Japanese army officers post Meiji Restoration. You can see that there's a ship in the background that's a steamship, so it shows that they have industrialized. You also see guns in the bottom right hand corner. It's them talking about battle strategy in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, which of course, hopefully you recognize the Russo-Japanese War as the first time in which an eastern country, Japan, successfully beats a western country, Russia, in battle. It shows that Japan's industrialization was more successful than places in the West, but also shows that non-Western places were capable of this industrialization. Okay, you also see economic reforms of the Tsarist government in Russia, and these are best exemplified by Alexander II's abolition of serfdom in 1861, which creates a large number of workers who can move to urban areas and work in factories now. The difference between Russian industrialism and Japanese industrialism, the biggest difference that is that foreign capital was used to finance Russia's, whereas domestic capital was used to finance Japan. France was heavily influential in building the Trans-Siberian Railroad and also in helping provide funds to build factories within Russia because the French wanted a strong Russia because they thought that it would help keep Germany in check. Contrary, in Japan, most of the money came from within the country. They didn't accept a lot of money from outside. However, both of these places do industrialize in the late 1800s. Both build factories, whereas Japan used their factories to make textiles and things like that. Russia used their factories to build heavy machinery. This is a possible DBQ. It's one that's on the College Board's website, so you might keep your eye out for that. And then finally, you have economic reforms of Muhammad Ali that I mentioned earlier. In Egypt, he reforms the economy of Egypt to embrace textile manufacturing, but also adopt Western views on commerce and education, both with regard to trading, but then also what is learned and how it is taught. This, of course, makes this part of the Ottoman Empire more aligned with the West, less aligned with the Islamic states that it had been before. To continue that discussion, let's talk about more global responses to industrialization. Some countries, instead of embracing industrialism and sponsoring their own efforts, adopted some aspects of it but resisted full-scale change. So there are two notable examples here, and this is a topic that you want to keep your eye out for as well. So the Ottoman Empire during this time period abolished their use of the Janissaries, which was an outdated practice. According to many, the Janissaries had become super powerful, and the Ottomans wanted to limit their power, and so they abolished them in the 1850s. The Janissaries, of course, didn't like that. They fought back and revolted, but the Ottoman Empire was able to successfully disband the Janissaries. Now, when they disband the Janissaries, they institute now a conscript army, one that is aligned with those of the West. In addition, the Ottomans institute the very important Tanzimat reforms, which put in place Western-style education, which angered the conservative Islamic scholars, the ulama. They also incorporated laws that were favorable to businesses, especially businesses from outside of the Ottoman Empire. They also oversaw the building of infrastructure projects like railroads and other types of road networks. To show that the Ottomans didn't completely sell out their Islamic faith, everyone likes to talk about the example of the fez or the new hat that new Ottoman soldiers wore. You'll see it on those three troops, picture here to the right. It didn't have a brim on it, so Islamic soldiers were able to touch their head to the ground during prayer. Their old hat had a cat, or it was a cap, and so it had a brim on it, and therefore it just goes to show you that even though they reformed the army, they did fit in some old Islamic practices as well. Now, eventually, even though the Ottomans do industrialize and westernize in some capacity, they don't do it enough for Western powers, so they end up having to sign a series of humiliating trade agreements called capitulations, where they bow to Western pressure. Same thing, same sort of things happen in the Qing Empire or the Qing dynasty in China. So initially, they resist British pressures to open their borders, and they fight in the Opium Wars. I don't think I need to say much about this. If you talked about it in class, you probably remember it. But anyways, the most important consequence of the Opium Wars were these spheres of influence that European powers had opened up in China. Several Western powers, I shouldn't just say Europe because the United States is one of them, now gained a foothold for trading in China, which is what they wanted. Now, as a result of this, the Chinese sought to reform themselves, and they did so through a series of reforms called the self-strengthening reforms, reforms that in which they sought to become more westernized. This also coincided with the 100 Days of Reform, which was another series of reform efforts done in the late 1800s, but it elicited a huge conservative response that was led by Empress Cixia, or the Empress Dowager, which hopefully you had talked about in class. These reforms also led to the abandonment of the civil service exam, and even though there was a conservative response to these things, China eventually was forced to also capitulate and sign a series of humiliating trade agreements with the West. So moving on, key concept 5.1, Roman numeral 6. The ways in which people organize themselves into societies also underwent significant transformations in industrialized states due to the fundamental restructuring of the global economy. So, society is going to change as a result of industrialization. The most important way that society changes is we see the emergence of new social classes, most importantly, the middle class. The middle class is a group of people who I am going to refer to as the petty bourgeoisie, who are mostly middle managers who consume a lot of stuff. If you see that picture right there, there is a lot of consumer items, to the candlesticks on the wall, to the table, to the chairs, to the tree, to the wreath, to the pictures, to the rugs, to everything. So these are consumers. Why are consumers important? Well, the more consumers you have, the more that needs to be produced, and the more workers you need, which lends way to the industrial working class or the proletariat. These are former peasants who work a lot in bad conditions, oftentimes in factories, and oftentimes in uncompromised and not fun work. All right, so there's also a change in social dynamics, which is exemplified by the changes in gender roles. Because men are oftentimes now going out to work instead of working at home on farms, you see the emergence of what we call the cult of domesticity, or the idea that women stay at home, men leave and go work, unless of course it's a family that is poor. In that case, everyone works. I just want to emphasize this, is that when women stay at home, they still work. They're just not going to places of employment, in that they're not earning a wage. But perhaps they should. Something to think about. Anyways, industrialization also changed family life for the majority of people, the proletariat, if you will. Family life became more disconnected because both parents many times were working 12 to 14-hour days. Men were oftentimes succumbing to alcoholism. Kids were working, getting maimed in machines, and caused a lot of stress. But we got companies out of it, so that's all right. And then finally, we see that demographics change, the most important one being that people migrate to cities. Urban areas become swelled during this time, and people leave their farms, move to the cities. People also migrate to other places, but I'm not going to talk about that here because that is the topic of video 5.4. And then lastly, this urbanization, which we just mentioned, had a lot of issues. Pictured here is the Death's Dispensary political cartoon that illustrates the cholera epidemic that plagued London in the mid-1800s. It was the result of overcrowding and unsanitary living conditions. There was one pump in particular that was right by an open sewer. This, of course, made people sick and killed them in large numbers. Now, there was a cholera epidemic not only in England, it swept to the United States, it was in India, it was throughout Europe, it was not just confined to England. But the reason I bring this up is because I can foresee this being a political cartoon that is on an AP test at some point in some capacity, be it a short answer, be it a DBQ, be it a multiple choice question. It's going to be there eventually. So hopefully you're watching this in the year that it is. Okay, other problems that were related with urbanization, there was a lack of time for planning, so cities just sort of sprung up. They weren't well thought out, and they were sort of disasters. There were tenement housing that were very poor, shoddy houses, and oftentimes either fell down or were not fit for living. There's pollution in that there were factories all over the place. There's political corruption. The list goes on and on and on and on and on. Anyway, if I was a peasant traveling from my peasant village to Manchester, England in the 1840s, this is what I saw. I'm not sure that is the world many of us want to live in. Anyways, that's one way to reach nirvana. This is your Buddha signing off.